Before I start, I want to give a thank you to Mark Jeffries, who's so graciously decided that he would critique my presentation. And Mark's a very, very busy guy, and I really do appreciate it, Mark.
And no pressure on you at all. So.
No, in fact, future presentations, if they go really, really bad, it's all Mark's fault. Okay. So let me start with a quick introduction. My name is Jim Nabata. I'm the CFO for the USA operations of WSP Genivar, and I'm going to keep walking in front of the screen if you don't mind. I like to walk around. WSP Genivar is a recent merger of two large engineering firms, two global firms. We have about 15,000 employees. We're almost $2 billion in revenue annually. And we are one of the single largest clients of Deltek Vision in the world. So enough about us. Wrong way. Okay. So throughout this conference, you're going to get your fair share of tips and tricks and various ways to utilize your Deltek system. But equally important is the need to identify cultural hurdles, to affect change management, and to actually make the most of your investment. Whether you're implementing a new system, changing existing systems, or simply trying to get the most out of your existing processes, cultural assessment plays a huge part in making that vision a reality. You know, if there are different cultures at play even within individual businesses, and our ability to understand how those differences are plays a huge part in the success and change management. And what we need to do is we need to see things through different lenses, which leads me to this picture. Can I get a show of hands if you've never seen this picture before? Never seen this picture before? Really? Oh, a few? Okay. All right. So for those who raised their hand, how many see a young woman? So a few. How many see an old woman? Those who raised their hand, how many see both? Oh, a couple. All right. When people see this picture for the first time, there's very few, if any, that see both. They have to be pointed out. See it now? So you got a young woman up there and an old woman. That's because we see things through different lenses, and our different points of view play a huge part in the success and change management. As an example, when a business process is put in place, it doesn't seem to stick. The lack of success is often seen differently depending on where you sit. We often hear some of these common themes from our corporate services in most businesses. It's a fairly consistent message and tone. While the operations of the business can see that same problem, that is lack of success, from a completely different point of view. If we don't take these differences into consideration, the best laid plans will inevitably lead to failure. And despite your most collaborative team sessions and management buy-in, your initiative will simply lead to this. I love this guy. Homer Simpson's got to be one of my favorite characters of all time. Everybody like Homer? He's just fantastic. I'm going to actually use Homer. He's going to help me through my presentation later on. But as a side note, I didn't watch the debate last night, but when I got up in the morning, checked my Twitter account, I saw there were lots of people that were talking about the debate. I thought that was great, but I thought Homer had the best comment on the debate. I'm only watching this thing because the moderator's name is Candy. Hear that, networks? Americans demand more food people. He's my favorite Twitter follow, the person I follow for Twitter. He's fantastic. The other thing about the debate, I didn't watch it, but I heard through Twitter that they actually have had a vocal presentation last night, a singing presentation, and this picture depicts it. Looks like a love song, doesn't it? I got you, babe. I saw that on Wall Street Journal this morning. I thought, man, they're really getting along this time. Okay, I'll go back to this picture 1 second. Because I've had to use this Deltek logo in all my presentations, I am required to say Deltek does not condone the strangling of others, just in case you're wondering. Okay? All right, so to understand what we mean by, or understand how culture plays a part in change management process, we need to define what we mean by culture. A simple definition of culture is this: that which distinguishes life in one group from life in another group. As an example, what looks like everything is A-OK in the United States can mean something completely different in Brazil. It's true. We're used to our cultures making sense to us because it's part of who we are and what we've done time after time after time. And it seems so strange to us when another group of people do something completely different. That's because our brains are hardwired to recognize what we know and what we've learned over time. And that's no different in our respective businesses. Any business culture that exists is simply a factor of long-term, ingrained habits developed over time. So I'll repeat that. Any business culture that exists is simply a factor of long-term, ingrained habits developed over time. It's important recognition, and one that's not understood in most businesses. Most people equate culture with the type of business it is. For example, it's got a family atmosphere, or it's a highly competitive environment. They wouldn't be wrong, but these are realities of how the business behaves. It got there through its habits. This fact is the reason why so many businesses, so many new businesses, can adapt to changes so quickly, and why it's so hard to define what their culture is. Because their habits haven't been defined, they haven't been developed over time. Our habits define our culture over time. And if we're to continually progress our respective businesses down paths of improvement, we need to recognize how those habits impact our ability to affect change. This engaging thriller, An Evolutionary Theory of Economic Change, seriously, engaging thrillers. You could see that in the title, right? Now, actually, despite the fact that it's not engaging or thrilling, it was groundbreaking. It came out in around 1985. And what the authors did is they did an in-depth study of a number of businesses for more than a decade. And what they concluded is that most businesses do not actually use rational thinking to move their businesses forward. Instead, what they do is they rely on historical habits. They may use rational thinking in their planning process, but when it comes to implementation, we naturally go back to what we're familiar with. What it says, in effect, is that we are creatures of habit. And those habits left unchanged will lead us back to where we were before. It's akin to Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same things over and over again and expecting different results. So what we've got to do instead is replace existing habits with new habits. And we need to do that in a way that provides a level of rigor and consistency to our approach. Michael Phelps is a great example of somebody who's developed a level of rigor and consistency in his habits. Phelps was born with an ideal swimmer's body. He has a long torso, short legs. It's a perfect swimmer's body, but so are most other competitive swimmers. What separates Phelps from others are his habits and how he trains and gets ready for his competition. Hopefully this will work. Great.
I just thought living in Baltimore was kind of the normal thing. Being on the water, living on the water, always surrounding myself with water. I started swimming at 7. The first couple of years I was afraid to put my face in the water. Just wasn't comfortable. Eventually just put it in and off I went. I spent so much time around it and so much time in it that, it's kind of like we're one. Anything is possible as long as you want it. You'll work for it. Doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. The only person that can really put pressure on you is yourself. As soon as I walk in the door, everything else that is going on in my life doesn't matter. It's like my brain shuts off. I don't have to think about anything. I'm there to swim. That's it.
By his own admission, Phelps did not become the most decorated Olympian of all time by being a superior athlete. It was his work routine, one of the most rigorous imaginable, became so ingrained as a part of who he is that it simply clicks on during competition. And no amount of distraction could break that concentration. Similar to what he talked about in his video. In fact, in I think it was the 2008 Beijing Olympic Games, 200-meter butterfly, Phelps' goggles completely filled with water. It's a death sentence for any competitive swimmer, except for Phelps. He not only went on to win the race and the gold, but he broke a world record. Truly amazing. He'd comment it later that he just did what came natural to him. His habits simply kicked in. But like anybody else, Phelps has his bad habits too. And by the way, Deltec does not condone the use of narcotics, just in case you're wondering. Okay. So none of what I'm saying is probably news to most of you. We all know that culture and personalities play a huge part in the success and change management. The question is, what do we do differently to take those realities into consideration? Well, part of the answer lies in making sure that change management is included as part of the project process in whatever initiative you're looking to put into place. It should be given its own phase or task number on your project and addressed at each meeting with as equal importance as planning and implementation. I'm going to walk you through some steps that I like to take in looking at the change management process and give you an example of a recent vision implementation that we did in the MEP business in the US. MEP standing for Mechanical, Electrical, Plumbing, Engineering, for those who don't know. Some which we did well, some not so well. The very first step in the process is to do a cultural assessment. You really need to take a hard look at your business and truly identify what the cultural realities are. I was new to WSP when we started looking at putting vision into business. And what I found is that, generally speaking, the culture was one of very high quality services to very demanding clients on large-scale, complex projects. It equated to a highly recognized brand for the MEP services they provide. But there were other cultural realities that would make the undertaking challenging, many of which are going to sound very familiar to you. I mean, the reality is we're not that distinct in our businesses. You look around all different businesses and you'll see the same thing all the time. A lot of the same things. There's some uniqueness. The accounting department was deeply rooted in a view that they know better about the performance of a project than a project manager does. There was little in terms of information or knowledge sharing, and there was a lack of financial management training to PMs. It was obvious to me early on that the financial management of projects was completely accounting-centric. Despite the fact that the business had been acquired 10 years prior, the integration of the business as one operating unit was still weak, and offices were still operating like individual entities. That wasn't just the case in the MEP business, but all businesses in the US. The business had been acquired by a publicly traded business, but still operated very much like a private partnership. And trust me, there's big differences in the way a public business and a private business can operate. And you often hear that businesses need to be more collaborative, but there's times when too much collaboration can get in the way of progress. And that was clearly evident in this case. And finally, there was a hierarchical view in the business. And the needs of the staff were often subordinated to the needs of managers. And that's the case in most businesses, quite honestly. And I've always struggled with that one personally, because I've always believed that you should strive to live by this famous creed. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Okay, so I've got a question, and I've got a prize for anybody who answers the question. Who first said this? Anybody know?
Yeah.
Yes.
Is it James Kirk?
Close. Who said it? Spock, yeah. Oh, there you go. Well, here's your prize. It's a Deltec lanyard. I know you always wanted one, Mark. So there you go. You know, I've used that quote many times over the years, but I never knew who actually. I would have expected Aristotle, maybe Plato, somebody like. But yeah, it was none other than Spock in the 1982 movie Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. And when I asked one of our younger marketing staff to get me a picture of Spock, she actually said, "Who's that?" I felt really, really old at that point in time. Okay, so you've gone through your cultural assessment, and now you realize you have a lot more work to do than just input a system or put in a new process. So what's next? Next, you need to identify the roadblocks to an effective implementation. What we were looking to do in WSP is effectively to try to put a new system in place. So we really needed to take a look at this. You know, the easy thing, did you have a question? Sorry.
Just kind of going back when you say about taking our cultural assessment, what do you suggest to do that if it's internally? Because you get a lot of
It's a great question, actually. I had probably the advantage of kind of coming into the business fresh, external view. And I think what you need to do is you need to take your own assessment of it internally, but you do need to take a second look. Somebody come in and take a fresh look at it. So that's tough to do unless you're actually fully engaged in the business. So if you could get people to, part of your management team to agree that, somebody come in and take a look at it. Otherwise, you've got to take a real serious look at it yourself and say, okay, what are the real realities here? Okay, so in identifying the roadblocks, the simple thing to do is just to look at your cultural assessment and say, okay, that's my roadblock. But you really need to dig a little bit further. You need to ask, how will the current culture be a potential roadblock? What within the identified culture can be the biggest hurdles to achieving your goals? More specifically, what are key habits that need to be changed to help ensure success? With the project we were looking to put into place in WSP, we took a look at the cultural assessment, and then we tried to identify the roadblocks. The culture of the accounting department was ingrained over many years and reinforced by the previous CFO. They lacked a true customer service focus, and they were very hardline in their approach at times. The reality was that if accounting was to be initiating much of change, they needed to change first. They, meaning me as well, because I was part of the accounting department. There was a reliance on local accounting teams to provide all their information and support. So what we needed to do is we needed to break that habit by actually restructuring the accounting teams, moving away from the reliance on local teams to more centralized approach. And what we also wanted to do was require management input of data. So it was almost a kind of forced habit change in some respects. I'll talk a little bit about both of these in a little bit. There was a view that senior managers should be treated like owners or partners, even though they took on no additional risk. And remember, we're going to a publicly traded business, so there's really no risk associated with it anymore, other than if you own some stock. And decision-making was slow. The typical decision in getting any real progress made was to go through the board, get approval, and then actually get consensus among all the senior vice presidents in the MEP business, which numbered over 30. So it just was a slow process at times. So what we needed to do there was simply just make the process a lot easier. And it's a difficult change for some folks. And while there may have been vocal support on key initiatives, the reality is the buy-in really wasn't there. The view was, it's okay for everybody else to change, but I can continue to do what I've always done. That sounds very familiar, I'm sure. Okay, so identifying these roadblocks and understanding these roadblocks, we then had to clear the road to make the path much easier. I put this picture up there because there's an important analogy. There's a reason why transportation departments painted lines in the road. Does anybody know? I don't have a prize. I gave up all my prizes just before. But anybody know why they painted lines in the road? It's an easy one, really. Logical. Come on. Yeah, it's to keep the driver within the lines. I know it sounds simple, but think about it. Think how most businesses go about introducing a new change. For example, a new system. They put industry best practices in their planning process. They roll out their system or process, hopefully with good training, good testing. But they often miss coming up with good ways to facilitate acceptance of the new system. If transportation departments relied on user guides and manuals to tell drivers how far off to the center and the right of road they should be, think of how many more accidents there'd be in the road. But we do this all the time in our respective businesses. We tell our users to refer to the guides, refer to the manuals, refer to the trainings, but we don't try to make it easy. Habits take shape so much easier and so much quicker when the pathway is well defined and easy to follow. As an example of what we did in WSP, we recognized that The PMs never accessed the system before. They never set up a project in the system, and they relied on accounting to fill in all their blanks. Our goal was to move from that accounting-centric model to a PM-centric model. As part of that process, we wanted the project manager to own the project process from cradle to grave, which included setting a project up in the system. So the reality was that the project manager was already going through a process of filling out an Excel form with all the project information in there. So what we want to do is make it easier, not only easier than the current form, but do it in such a way that keeps the driver within the lines. So we got that in this. It's a fairly simple form, and this is the only part that the project manager really has to focus on. It's a fairly simple form that sits on the project info center. It's not only simple in its construct, but it visually shows the steps a project manager needs to take to set up a project. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, done. So why we did this? I mean, we did it specifically to clear that road. We even called it project manager steps to make it that much easier. It's almost like a project setup for dummies. All right, so how many project managers are in here? Am I in trouble? Another example of what we did of clearing the road was what we did with project planning. Project plans in our business not only drive results, but they, in terms of revenue recognition, backlog, or even billing, but they serve as a proactive means of communicating expectation to project teams. Remember, we wanted to move to a PM-centric model, and underpinning all of that would be effective project planning. So what it means is we had Delta create a customization that would auto-spread effort based on standard templates and standard fees. So by clicking on this Use Default Fees checkbox and clicking on Save, the PM's only seconds away from the plan actually being created. They don't need to go in and fill it out and spread it out on a month-by-month basis or whatever model you're using. So they just need to go into that planning module, enter the project, click OK, and you get your results. We did this to make it simple. We did this to make the transition easier. In the process, we also made making that habit much easier, much quicker as a result of the simple and consistent approach, which leads me to the next step, CPR. I'm not talking about breathing life into our project managers, although sometimes that's not a bad idea. What I'm talking about is consistent, predictable, and repeatable practices. How our systems and our processes operate need to function as much as practical, the same way every time throughout the whole business. And that sounds very rigid, and it's often argued that it takes away from creativity. But some of the most creative people in the world also have some of the most ingrained habits. Take Steve Jobs, for example. Anybody read his book? Yeah, I mean, he was filled with lots of habits, wasn't he? I mean, Steve Jobs has another tough choice to make. I've got a keynote to deliver. What can I wear? But he was, literally, I mean, the guy, his eating habits and everything else, I mean, filled with lots of habits. So you don't necessarily need to take away from that creativity aspect. Okay, so as we discussed, our habits define our culture over time. And as part of the change management process, we need to recognize how those habits impact our change. And we need to look at how we change our culture. To do this most effectively, we need to replace existing habits with new habits. And we need to do it in a way that makes it easy. The way the brain works is that it stores habits much easier and much quicker when it's done the same way time after time. If I try to learn to drive for the first time, but you keep changing where the steering wheel is, it's going to take me a lot longer to learn. Okay, so you've gone through your cultural assessment, you identified your roadblocks, you cleared the road as much as practical, and you develop consistent, predictable, and repeatable practices. Now comes the hard part. If you wish to change things up, you first need to change. I'm not talking about dealing with the change of a new system or process. I'm talking about is looking at your culture, what your culture looks like as a change agent, and defining what changes in culture, what changes in habit you need to take on. Let's go back to the example of the accounting function. So we had an accounting function that believed they were more important than the operations of the business. And they set this tone in how they communicated. And that culture needed to change and change quickly. Now, unfortunately, it did mean that there were some personnel changes. But for the most part, what it meant was coaching and guiding our staff to communicate differently, to be proactive in how they provided information, and to consistently, predictably, and repeatedly reinforce the notion that their only role in the business is to serve others. By accepting our own shortcomings and changing our own behaviors and habits, sometimes radically, it opens the doors to others accepting change as well. Lastly, you need to recognize that change doesn't happen overnight. All great leaders, statesmen, inventors in history had to deal with a lot of failure before they attained success. That's because they remained persistent and determined in the long run. You will get frustrated, lose patience, and sometimes want to give up. But the ability to stay persistent and determined, to stay the course, will pay off. A great example of this is Abraham Lincoln. As a young man, Lincoln went to war a captain, but he actually came home a private. Later, he failed as a businessman, and as a lawyer, he went largely unsuccessful. Then he turned to politics, where he failed over and over again. In his application to be commissioner of General Land Office, running for state legislature, for Congress, in senatorial elections twice, and in his bid to be vice president in 1856. But he never gave up, and success followed over time. Change management is a frustrating process, especially when change doesn't happen as quickly as we'd like it to. But the ability to stay determined will pay off. We live in a world of immediate gratification, but we need to stay the course. Which leads me into the next video. It's from the website TED.com. How many have gone to TED? It's a great website, isn't it? Lots of vignettes on educational, inspirational. You know where I'm going with this? All right, it's actually pretty funny. Okay, so enjoy.
I'm here because I have a very important message. I think we have found the most important factor for success. And it was found close to here, Stanford. Psychology professor took kids that were 4 years old and put them in a room all by themselves. And he would tell the child, a 4-year-old kid, Johnny, I'm going to leave you here with a marshmallow for 15 minutes. If after I come back, this marshmallow is here, you will get another one. So you will have two. To tell a 4-year-old kid to wait 15 minutes for something that they like is equivalent to tell us, we'll bring you coffee in 2 hours. Exact equivalent. So, what happened when the professor left the room? As soon as the door closed, 2 out of 3 ate the marshmallow. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 40 seconds, 50 seconds, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 8 minutes. Some lasted 14 and a half minutes. Couldn't do it. Could not wait. What's interesting is that 1 out of 3 would look at the marshmallow and go like this. Would look at it, put it back. They would walk around. They would play with their skirts, pants. That child already at 4 understood the most important principle for success, which is the ability to delay gratification. Self-discipline, the most important factor for success. 15 years later, 14, 15 years later, follow-up study. What did they find? They went to look for these kids who were now 18 and 19, and they found that 100% of the children that had not eaten the marshmallow were successful. They had good grades, they were doing wonderful, they were happy, they had their plans, they had good relationship with the teachers, students, they were doing fine. A great percentage of the kids that ate the marshmallow, they were in trouble. They did not make it to the university, they had bad grades, some of them dropped out, a few were still there with bad grades, a few had good grades. I had a question in my mind. Will Hispanic kids react the same way as the American kids? So I went to Colombia, and I reproduced the experiment, and it was very funny. I used 4, 5, and 6 years old kids. And let me show you what happened.
Hasta para un niño de 4 años es atractiva la idea de tener el 100% de retorno a la inversión en 15 minutos. Sin embargo, algunos de ellos, tan pronto la puerta se cerró, se comieron el marshmallow inmediatamente. Otros, en cambio, resistieron el impulso.
So, what happened in Colombia? Hispanic kids, 2 out of 3 ate the marshmallow, 1 out of 3 did not. This little girl was interesting. She ate the inside of the marshmallow. In other words, she wanted us to think that she had not eaten it, so she would get 2, but she ate it. So we know she'll be successful, but we have to watch her. Okay? She should not go into banking, for example, or work in a cash register, but she will be successful.
You know, I'm always amazed when I watch that, and it just makes me smile every time when she actually takes that bite and you hear the audience, and I heard it a little bit here too, this sigh like, oh, when she's gone that far, and oh. All right, so I want to just quickly go through the steps that I talked about, the kind of 6 steps. But as I said before, I want to use my friend Homer Simpson to guide us through these steps.
If you don't like your job, you don't strike. You just go in every day and do it really half-assed. That's the American way.
So assess your culture and realize what you have in front of you.
Jeez Louise, look at this mess.
Identify the roadblocks to progress.
Woohoo!
Clear the road. I love that woohoo.
I think I have a collapsed lung.
Apply CPR, consistent, predictable, and repeatable practice to help ensure success.
I'm no longer the money-driven workaholic I once was.
Radiate the change you want to see.
You tried your best, and you failed miserably. The lesson is, never try.
And despite Homer's advice, stick to it. Don't eat the marshmallows. So, you know, when I showed my youngest son that video before, and I asked him, what would you do? Would you be determined? Would you stay the course? And he looked at me confidently. He said, absolutely. I hate the taste of marshmallows. Sort of lost the point there. All right, just to wrap this up, I want to just quickly go over a couple other steps to consider in the whole change management process to think about. We all know that buy-in is essential, but equally important is to get our operational leaders actually driving the change. You know, for those of you that sit in corporate function, you know that resistance is much more likely when it's being driven from a corporate function. So you've got to get your operational leaders actually leading the charge. That's very important. The whole process around change is a difficult one when staff don't understand what's in it for them. You know, if they look at a new process, for example, and they see that it's more work. It may not be more work, but it may seem so because it's new and unfamiliar. So what you've got to do, I think what you've got to do is you've got to sell to your staff what's in it for them. With the changes we were looking to put into place in WSP, we didn't want to just sell the concept of project planning to increase profitability, but we wanted to sell as well the fact that we wanted to increase business acumen across all of our staff. We wanted to increase the leadership opportunities across all staff. And that's not just a sales job. I mean, I feel very strongly about trying to increase leadership opportunities across the entire business. The added benefit is that as the business acumen grows and the leadership opportunities grow, so should the profit. So you get what you want at the end of the day. Has anybody heard of the Rule of Seven, the marketing Rule of Seven? Yeah, you've heard of it before? It basically says that in terms of trying to get a prospect to buy your product, you need to communicate at least 7 times. Now, whether you use communication 7 times or 17 times, there's no such thing as over-communication when you have a really important change item you want to put into the business. So I really strongly urge that you over-communicate. Don't be afraid of doing that. Find operational staff that can serve as champions for your cause. These should be staff that not only believe in your cause, but are driven, effective communicators, and have some level of skill set that can serve as an example for others to follow. And finally, you'll find at the end of the day that your final product will need its own change process. Accepting that fact and communicating your flexibility to change will help change things in the long run. Okay, so that's all I had. Any questions? Got a little bit of time. Yes?
So in your case study, the roadblock examples, I noticed you had a bullet up that mentioned the silo mentality, but also too much collaboration. Those seem a little bit incongruent. Were you referring to the decision-making process?
Well, in this particular, yes, but in this particular case, you know, the silo mentality was really around not having consistent approach. So what you had is you had all these offices kind of doing their own thing, working off different systems, different ways of doing things. So there wasn't that, in terms of what you're talking about, there wasn't that kind of consistent collaborative approach. At the same time, when the actual decision-making process was going on, then everybody wanted to have a say. And honestly, to get any real progress going, we needed to shorten that kind of life cycle of the decision. Does that answer your question? Great. Anybody else? Oh.
Project planning, can you expand on your example? Because, you know, we try project planning and vision and
Right.
fail, and, you know, you build a little template.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is the time for this, maybe afterward, but I'd really like to understand how the little template, because I know it goes, you know, the time goes through automatically when the project's already set up.
Well, in this particular case, we had an MEP business, and the way the MEP business operated, it had a lot of the same type of projects, you know, same tasks, same phases, and same fee structure in a lot of cases. So it was easy to actually create a template that allowed you to just go in and say, okay, if you've got this sort of setup, it'll spread this automatically. I could go over it with you after, but it doesn't work in every case. And so what I've actually been talking to Deltek about is, do we create, right, Ed? Do we create a grid that actually allows you to do that across multi-disciplines? Because this isn't just for the MEP business, it's for all of our services. But I could show you a little bit of how that works. Sorry, Mark.
Not that it's my place, but I have a question for you.
All right. No, it is your place. Go.
Okay. Yesterday, Chip Heath, in his great presentation, told us to look for the bright spots. Now, you could argue that going for the roadblocks is you looking for the dark spots. Almost the opposite. What were your feelings on Chip Heath's advice versus what you were advising us this morning?
This is what I was afraid of, inviting you to this. I knew this was coming. No, actually, I read Chip's book, and I told Chip afterwards that I appreciated it because his whole analogy around the glove I used in the business practice, and it worked really, really well. You're right. I mean, you've got to find the bright spots, and you know, I knew Chip was going to say that anyway, so I just said, okay, I'll skip that message. But you know, the whole aspect of finding operational staff that can serve as champions for your cause, that's a huge bright spot, and that actually pushes a lot of change in the business. The fact that you're changing things up, your culture's changing, you know, personally, and within your group, that's a huge bright spot. They are challenges, but we've got to identify, we've got to recognize those challenges. As long as we recognize those challenges and deal with them in a sensible way, then that's a bright spot in itself. So it doesn't, it's not specific to bright spots, but yeah, there is a hidden message in there, I think.
Well, and I think Chip talked some about changing the environment to change behavior, and in order to change the environment, some of the things you might have to do are assess things that need to go as well as things that need to stay. I do have a question about say you're in the middle maybe of rolling out some new tools or an implementation, and you didn't put some of this into effect at the beginning. What would you say about kind of how would you move forward at that point?
Yeah, I mean, part of that is that the timeline in doing all this was a very truncated schedule. And I constantly heard from Deltek, our project manager sitting back there, that this is a tight schedule, this is a tight schedule. And it was. So we had to sort of do it as we went along. And the other aspect, I came into the business, and as most people come into a business, especially in the engineering environment, you've got a business that's, most people have been there for a long, long time, and it's tough to change that. So, you've got to sort of pick and choose sometimes, and what you have to do is the old analogy about how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. And so doing all that change at the very beginning was probably not a practical process, but doing it as we went along made a lot of sense. Does that answer your question?
So as a professional services company, what was your goal?
What was our, okay, that's a good question. So what happened was we were really trying to put project planning into the business, and it just wasn't getting the momentum. And so the glove example that Chip gave is I was at a senior management meeting, and I put up a big number 9 on the screen. And that's all I did. And then I kind of walked back and said, okay, tell me what this is. What does it represent? And I got all sorts of answers. And I said, that's how much money we lost in millions of dollars just last year in not having project planning in place. And it was amazing, the transformation. They talked about that for a long time. Give us the detail. We gave them the detail. We recently had a budget meeting where they presented their operational plans. The very number 1 agenda, and I didn't prompt them for this, the number 1 agenda on everybody's, without even talking to each other, was project planning. So I think it was very effective in that sense. Visuals make a lot. I mean, I don't like using bullets because I think visuals actually, they get the message across a lot easier. The resistance? Just kick them out. Well, yeah, I mean, you've got to pick and choose on the resistance level. I mean, the reality is we've got a finite amount of time. A finite amount of time when we're putting change through, a finite amount of time in terms of our own personal time. I mean, the big piece is you try to do as much coaching and guiding and getting people on board. But like I said, I mean, we did have to do some personnel changes just because the resistance level was that high in some cases that you needed to change a little bit. But, to answer your question, it varies. It depends on the individual. It depends on their willingness to change in the long run. Because some people, no matter how sensible it is, no matter how much you tell them this is valuable for you, they just are going to be resistant to that. And that's okay in the scheme of things. And the reality is, and we hate to say this, but the reality is they may be a better fit somewhere else. Paul?
Kind of a bright spot idea. You mentioned finding what's in it for me to the project manager. When you find that, and particularly if it's consistent with your overall goals, what's in it for me, then that's the bright spot that you're trying to help them see. Their situation is a composite of bright spots and dark spots for a given individual. And the bright spot is what's in it for me that's consistent with the company's goals. And if I can help you achieve what you want to achieve, that will contribute to the company as well. Now you're seeing me as the person who's helping you get where you want to go.
Absolutely. It's a great point. I mean, that's ideally why we wanted to sell it that way. It wasn't, It wasn't a kind of, oh, we're going to just do a shell game to say this is why we're doing it. It really was to show that we want to help and we want to be there for staff.
How did you capture the $9 million? Just in a generalized format, because if you look at utilization, I wouldn't know how to capture that.
Oh, it's just basically looking at the project profitability from this January, we're on a calendar year, and looking from January to December and saying, how much do we have in terms of losses? And what I'm saying is, look, if we have really good project planning in place, that people are actually going in and they're setting expectations with their project teams, we wouldn't have these kind of losses. It may not be, $9 million savings, but it could be a significant savings because you know how project planning works. It's the whole 6P principle. What do they call that? Proper prior planning prevents poor performance. You think about it. You think about it ahead of time. And all of a sudden it changes the dynamics. And basically you're setting expectations with your teams to say, this is how much money we have to spend. Can't spend any less than this. Or more than this. Less, hopefully, yeah. Okay, lots of questions. I'm just cognizant of time here, but we got some time. Yes?
You talked about replacing existing habits. Did you describe a little bit how you went about measuring how are we doing? What milestones, how you evaluate whether people are adopting, et cetera?
Well, part of that is came through in the project planning. So what we did is we had a kind of drop dead date where we said everybody needs to put plans into the system, and then they need to update forecasts regularly. And what comes out of that is our backlog report. So if you're not getting backlog information that's consistent with what they're keeping in their head or on their spreadsheet, then we know that's not happening. And we gave it to the operational leaders of each office to say, you need to find a way to get your staff there. Do it creatively, do whatever you need to do, but tell us how it's going. So we actually have measurements to be able to say, okay, people are doing their plans, and we have project accounting teams across the U.S., so they actually focus in on defining whether the forecasts are being updated correctly. So that's our kind of measure, and then on the side of just kind of behavioral changes, like for accounting, for example, is just me going out to the operational leader saying, how has our customer service improved? What's done differently? And I got a lot of feedback that there's been a lot of positive change. So measurements weren't quite there, but we had some ways of at least defining that.
You mentioned stay determined, and you also mentioned be flexible. Can you talk about the balance of those two?
Yeah, it's tough, huh? Well, you got to be flexible in the sense that you can be determined, and you can be flexible at the same time. In other words, your ultimate goal at the end of the day should not waver, because that's what you believed in your heart to be the right way. I mean, our example was, I believe that the PMs should own the project process. It shouldn't be in the hands of accounting. We want those PMs to be real business leaders. And that fundamentally shouldn't change. Being flexible enough to say, okay, well, maybe we need to adopt different practices here along the way is absolutely critical. So it's the end goal being determined, but in the middle there's some flexibility.
When you talk about what's in it for me and the incentive program, we actually have a customer that was very successful with a true incentive program with rewards and gamification and badging, and those are terms you hear thrown around. Do you think that could work for everyone? I mean, do you think we're going to see more of that in the future, or do you think that's kind of a trend?
I absolutely think that's a great way to look at it. I think what happens is management teams always think, well, it's got to be in the pay, it's got to be in the bonus. If it's not in the pay and the bonus, they're not going to want to do it. And that's not a reality. I mean, if you look at any HR data, they'll tell you that compensation is usually anywhere from third to fifth on terms of priorities. It's about doing the things you're talking about, not necessarily the words, but ways to incentivize people differently than just pure compensation. So they're great ideas. We haven't adopted that in this particular instance, but there's other instances where we've done that.
So what was the message to the accounting staff about what their leadership opportunities might be as a result, and
Right. Well, but I think the important thing is to understand that from an accounting perspective, they own the project process, the project control process. So that didn't go away. The reality, and it's a difficult change because the view is, oh, it's mine. I've got the project. But in reality, when you discuss with them exactly what the anticipation is and set the expectations early on, because I think that's the key is we don't set expectations very well in our respective businesses. We don't sit there and say, look, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. If you do this, this is what's going to happen. And I was very clear with my accounting team that I would continually raise the bar every time because I want to see you do better. And if you've got the bar this low, guess what? You're just going to walk right over that bar. So it was less about the losing control, and it was more about gaining respect for what they're doing in the business and making sure that they understand that. And the fact that they actually do have increased opportunities because beyond their piece, we could spend more time on things that matter to the business.
So as individuals, we can be a little bit delusional about our abilities sometimes as far as we're better looking or smarter than.
Well, you may be, but not me. Ooh.
Well, studies have shown that, right? So in your experience, I noticed that you mentioned that corporations tend to fall back to their old habits versus logic. So looking for some, your insights, what you've seen as far as do corporations delude themselves about what their real culture is versus what's in their marketing literature?
Oh yeah. Oh. I just had this conversation with somebody about mission statement, and I read a mission statement in an engineering firm. They all sound the same, don't they? And we don't take that seriously. We don't. I mean, that should be the roadmap for everybody in that business and for our clients to understand what core fundamental values we believe are going to drive this business forward. And you're right. We feel, exceed client expectations. I love that one. I mean, how many have exceed client expectations in their mission statement? We don't even set expectations with our clients. How can we exceed it? So, yeah, you're right. I mean, there is a, I wouldn't call it delusional, but there is a sense that, we're doing the things right because guess what? Look at the bottom line. Look at the bottom line. And it's not all, we all know it's not all about the bottom line. At the end of the day, we're here to make money. And we're here to, contribute back to our shareholders, to hopefully contribute back to the community. But if we don't take that seriously, that piece seriously, and say to ourselves, what are we doing wrong? Or what are we doing right? To bright spots. Then you're right. I mean, we're just kind of kidding ourselves that we're on the right track. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of my view. Is that helpful? Okay. All right, no more questions. I do appreciate the time, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Live long and prosper.